Hello, and thank you for joining us here on this webinar on trauma and healing, pathways to recovery. This is pre-recorded due to the very busy season this is in the summer and busy weeks we've had here, so haven't been able to honor the live schedule, and I apologize, but wanted to record this so that we get this out to you. And so we're going to talk about trauma and healing, particularly one model we're going to spend most of our time on talking through, and it's one of the more effective or most effective ways in which we can work with clients through trauma and heal them from the trauma. But we'll also, before we get to that, we'll briefly mention some other ways or therapeutic approaches that you can use when working with your clients through trauma. All right, well, let's go ahead and delve right into this. I suspect we might take somewhere around maybe 30, 45 minutes, but we'll see. All right, well, first, let's go ahead and understand trauma. So the first couple of slides will be about just understanding what trauma is. And so there's different types of trauma. There's acute trauma. There's chronic trauma. There's complex trauma. There's developmental trauma. There's a neurobiological impact that we'll talk about as well. There's psychological and relational effects, as we all know as well. And so because of this, trauma is not a one-size-fits-all, and it does show up differently across all clients. When you're working with someone with any type of trauma, do not use a one-size-fits-all approach. The last therapeutic approach that we use, that I'm going to show you, can be fairly used with most people. I will say that, but you might have to modify different parts of it in order to fit the person that you're dealing with. But let's go ahead and understand some of these terms a bit better here. So acute trauma, that is when there's a single event. It's still overwhelming, like a car accident, assault, even maybe a death, or at least a death where a person gets over it or gets through it. I don't want to, that sounds so disconnected and uncompassionate, but when they heal from the death and the grieving of the death, but sometimes that can be categorized under acute trauma. But it's intense and it's time limited stress. Think about that, right? So intense, but time limited. So after a certain time, usually a short amount of time, maybe a few months, even a year. Okay, you can even extend that out a year and maybe even a little over a year. That can be acute stress. A chronic stress, that's something that's prolonged or repeated. It occurs several times. That can be like ongoing abuse. That can be something that is just happening multiple times. That, of course, has the potential to be very much more impactful to the person when there's chronic trauma. Then there's complex trauma. This is multiple interpersonal traumas, often in caregiving context. Grief or death can move from acute to chronic and then to complex. Okay, this is if it is prolonged over a long period of time, usually several years. Okay, but PTSD also can sometimes fall within complex trauma because it impacts a person's self-concept, their ability to regulate their emotions, and even their interpersonal relationships. But those are some types of trauma: acute, chronic, complex. Then there's developmental trauma. Developmental trauma can be a type of acute, chronic, or complex, but the reason why we call it developmental trauma is because there's adversity during a critical childhood period, a period where the person was developing, and so that's why it gets labeled as developmental trauma. It's impacted some sort of developmental milestone and disrupted attachment or emotional development or even executive functioning, ability to like concentrate or reason, things like that. And so those are the types of trauma. What is trauma? Okay, when we use that word, what is trauma? So off the bat, I'll say this: trauma isn't necessarily the situation, rather it's the response to situation. Again, it's not the situation, it's the response to situation. So trauma is a psychological, emotional, okay, and physiological response to an event that overwhelms an individual's ability to cope. It fundamentally changes one's sense of safety, self, and ability to regulate emotions. That's what trauma is and does. Okay? So some key aspects is that it threatens perception. Okay, so an event is experienced as life-threatening or deeply violating. This is why trauma isn't just limited to things like car accidents, deaths, or war, but it can also be relationships and like infidelity. That could be a very traumatic response because the individual was deeply violated. Okay, but of course other things such as abuse, that's traumatic. Trauma is also subjective. It's a subjective experience. Two people can experience the same event and experience it very differently. So what's traumatic for one may not be traumatic for the other, but that other person may have been able to manage. So if you go back to the top and look at that definition up there, so whereas one person, they weren't able to cope. They didn't have the ability to cope. It did overwhelm them. Their psychosocial and physiological and emotional responses to it were poor. And so as a result of that, it changed their sense of safety, their sense of self, and their ability to regulate. Whereas one person, that's not true, because I'm not going to repeat that was a mouthful, but that's not true for them. They were able to manage through all of those things. And so again, trauma isn't the situation, rather it's how a person responds to it. Trauma is also is systemic. It's multi-systemic, meaning it just doesn't impact one area of a person. Okay, as we've already read, it impacts emotions, right? Like fear, shame, helplessness, hopelessness, despair, right? Cognition, right? The intrusive thoughts, the flooding. It alters the memories, the beliefs about self-concept, self-efficacy. Behavior, it impacts a person's behavior, the avoidance, the isolation, maybe even hypervigilance, obsessiveness. It also changes physiology, okay? So it's, for example, heightened arousal. It changes some of the brain functions or brain structures. It changes hormones and how much or how little are regulated in the brain throughout the body. And so it's multi-systemic. The other thing is, and I know it's not listed here, but it also impacts the people around the person who is traumatized. And so that because that person has to interact with other people in their community, the trauma then is now affecting those who are not even firsthand experiencers of the trauma. A good example of that was in 9/11. When 9/11 happened, people who experienced it firsthand, who were there, or even people who've seen it over on like television, those people or the family members of those people, and even the children of the mothers that were involved reported certain stress changes in stress management and coping ability because of that. And so trauma can actually have very far-reaching effects. I know we're not talking about that aspect of things today, but just to throw that out there so that you know the seriousness of trauma. And so what happens in the brain? Okay, what happens in the brain? And after we talk about this, we'll get into some evidence-based treatments. But what happens in the brain in trauma is that the brain's alarm system, the amygdala, and if you're looking at the screen, the amygdala, it's like the center of the brain, okay? Like right above the brain stem, right in the center, behind the frontal lobe. That's where your alarm system, is. But when trauma happens, the amygdala stays on high alert, causing the person to feel as if they're in a constant state of survival, so that they're constantly on edge, they're constantly in fear. It's like the alarm is just going off, it's going off, it's going off. Person who manages or experiences the incident differently, the amygdala deactivates, or it goes back to normal. The person who didn't handle it well, the amygdala, actually, that system stays on. So think about the alarm. It just keeps going and going and going and going and going. If you've ever cooked something in your house and maybe you started to burn it like I have, and the smoke alarm goes off, and you fan the smoke and you try to turn the fire alarm off, but the smoke alarm, but it just keeps going. That's what's happening here. Okay, so they stay on this state of edge. The other things that happen are hormones, specifically cortisol. That's your stress hormone. That also is in the brain and it's active and it gets released, and the levels of cortisol remain high. Okay, and that those amounts and levels of cortisol, because they're in your brain and at high levels, it actually begins to shrink the memory center, the hippocampus. Okay, and now this is important because knowing this helps us know how to employ different interventions. Okay, and this is part of why I'm going over this. But it shrinks the memory center, and it leads to some intrusive memories, fragmented memories, jumbled memories, and that's actually going to be part of the treatment that I talk about here today. But that's one of the things that cortisol does do when trauma happens to an individual. The thinking and planning part of the brain, which is the prefrontal cortex, and just for reference, the hippocampus also is located in the center. Where's your prefrontal cortex? That's the front part of your brain, and that's responsible for your prefrontal cortex. That's responsible for rational thought, for slower processing, slower of things. It's not as reactive as the alarm center. It's your executive functioning. That's where you make sense of things. But what happens here, that part of your brain actually slows down, controlling your emotions and concentrating a lot harder, because that part of your brain actually slows down. The other thing is that your body's stress responses, or stress response, it goes out of balance. The HPA axis, that's responsible for different chemicals and different hormones. That's the hypothalamic pituitary adrenaline axis, just known as HPA. Just say HPA. But that part of your body, that's your body's central response system. And so what happens there is it gets thrown out of whack, and you're just always on edge. The other thing that happens is there's shifts in brain chemicals. Okay, brain chemicals that are responsible also for your mood, but because your brain is in this alarm state, it's not regulating the chemicals properly, and so you do have anxiety, or you may have a low mood. You may feel disconnected. Your serotonin levels may be off. All of these things that would ordinarily keep you calm and connected are just thrown out of whack. So overall, these changes trap people in this persistent state of survival mode. Again, think of the alarm just going off in a person's brain, and they're just there fanning the smoke, trying to get it to go away, and it's just not happening. And so that's what goes on in the brain. Okay, let's get into some effective evidence-based treatments. All right, so if you're looking on the slide, you can see that the first two are highlighted in blue. I highlighted those in blue because those are the two that are the most effective that research shows. And the very first one, reintegrating memories via the hippocampus, that's the one I'm going to show you guys today, that I'm going to walk you through today, because that has a very high level of efficacy. So I want to walk you through how to actually do that when you're working with your clients. Okay, so I'll skip over that one and go right to the re-engaging the prefrontal cortex. The re-engaging, as we just spoke a moment ago, the prefrontal cortex is in charge of critical thinking, executive functionings, right? And so one of the things you want to help the client do is gain control over that. because what's happening is they're not engaging that part of their brain. And so that might very literally look like engaging in some CBT building skills, okay? Helping them slow down, helping them be mindful, helping them test their thoughts, whether or not their thoughts are true, whether or not their thoughts are accurate, and really working with them cognitively to rebuild healthy thinking, healthy ways of interacting cognitively. And that is extremely helpful when dealing with individuals who have experienced trauma. Okay. The next one is down regulating the amygdala. And what down regulating that? I know that sounds very technical, but remember, your amygdala, that's part of your sensory, part of your emotions. And so in the moment, it's heightened. And so what you want to do is you want to help down regulate. You want to help bring some of those emotions down. And so you can use grounding exercises for that. Ground them to the chair, ground them to the floor. It's important in that way because that's sensory, okay? Meaning they can feel the chair, they can feel the floor, they can feel their hands if they're gripping on something. They can feel themselves breathing. And when that happens, that actually helps some of the executive functions take place. You know, when a person begins to breathe properly and breathe in a nice, steady pace, they're allowing blood oxygenation. I can't even say the word. But they're basically allowing blood to circulate to their brain and oxygenate. Oh, boy. That's not going to go over well in the recording. But anyway, it helps to circulate oxygen via the blood to the brain. Okay. And that's what you want. And because the more you do that, the more efficient the prefrontal cortex is at doing what it's designed to do. And that's thinking rationally and calming down other parts of the brain. And so you'll do that again. Grounding techniques, sensory techniques, that's really effective. The other thing you may want to do is help to rebalance the HPA axis. Okay, I spoke about that just a moment ago. And the way you do that is you can do that through stress management practices. So that can also be through breathing exercises. That can be through mindfulness practices like meditation. It can be through yoga if some of your clients, and when I say yoga, I'm not referring to yoga where you're engaging spiritually with other entities, but stretching. This is what I'm referring to. So, you know, you can even do this with Pilates. There are research that shows that doing Pilates in a therapeutic setting, joining Pilates with mindfulness, that's a very effective way to help a person sort of restabilize and lessen some of their cortisol levels, their stress, that stress hormone that's stressing them out, and regulating sort of the melatonin levels in their body to help them sleep. And so that can be very helpful because, again, this is what you want to do. You want to get those cortisol levels down. You want to get your circadian rhythms back, and that can be done through activities like that. Exercise can work. Bike riding, running, walking, those things are very helpful as well. The other thing, or the next point, is restoring neurotransmitter equilibrium. Okay, again, very technical, but what we're talking about here is behavioral activation. It can also be achieved through exercise or through something that someone enjoys doing. And the reason why this happens is, or the reason why this is helpful, is because it increases dopamine levels, and it makes a person feel good when they engage in whatever it is that they're doing, and it eases that anxiety and it eases the depression. And so when you're working with someone who has experienced trauma, you want to make sure you're incorporating things that they enjoy doing. If they enjoy bowling, have them go bowling once a week. If they enjoy painting, have them paint something for you and then bring it in and maybe talk about it or process through it. But those activities, they restore some of the neurotransmission, the equilibrium of neurotransmitters. And the neurotransmitters currently in a traumatic state or a traumatic heightened brain, they're firing on all cylinders, they're misfiring, and they're making the incorrect or unhealthy connections with memory and with triggers. And so this is why you want to have them engage in that, so that can be restored in a healthy way. And also, the last bit here before we get into the first one that I had said earlier, rewiring the network connectivity. Again, technical term, but basically what you're doing when you rewire network connectivity, that neurological language there is basically you're helping them reconnect the brain's emotion and thinking centers in a healthy way, and that is quite done. That's quite frankly, that's done very well via talk therapy. A lot of what you probably already do, helping them talk through their problems. Think about it like a switchboard. When trauma happens, the switchboard gets all out of whack, and the connections are just all mixed together, and everything is confused. And so talking through the wiring helps them make the correct connections. It takes out the incorrect connections and it plugs in the correct connections. And so you rewire that neurological, the neurological pathways in their brain. You help to diminish the ones that are unhealthy and highlight the ones that are healthy. All right, so I know I ran through that fairly quickly, but that's so that I can have some time here talking about the first one, which is, again, reintegrating memories via the hippocampus. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into this. And this will be sort of a step-by-step guide. I highlighted this one to go through because this is one of the most effective ways when working with someone who is experiencing trauma, especially severe trauma where they're reporting flashbacks and triggers and flooding and sleepless nights and crying spells and maybe even isolation, maybe feelings of depression, when it's reached a level that we would consider unmanageable. Okay. So just a little, for a little example, this is Sarah. She's 38-year-old survivor of a single traumatic assault. Okay. She had an assault happen to her, and through trauma-focused narrative therapy, to reconsolidate her fragmented memories into a coherent time sequence story. And that is essentially what we're doing. We're taking those fragmented memories and putting them into a time sequence story. Okay. The reason why we're doing that is because it will rebalance her and give her control over her narrative, and it will plug in some of the gaps that exist in her memory. One of the things, like I said, trauma does is it fragments the memories, and so because the memory's fragmented, we put in incorrect information in the parts that are missing, and it's those parts that are often very troubling. So the first thing you do is you establish safety and context. Okay, so you might say, today we'll begin by placing trauma within the larger context of your life. Remember, at any point, if you feel distressed, we'll pause and use grounding techniques. Okay. Sarah, one of the things that she'll do, she'll practice a brief 3-2-1 grounding technique, and that's naming three things, naming three things, two sounds that she hears, and then one thing that she feels. And so quite literally, she might say, I see a chair, I see a cup, I see a clock, I hear ticking, I hear birds singing, and I feel the chair. That's a 3-2-1 grounding technique. And what that does is it grounds the person back to the present. Okay, it orients them to the here and to the now. Because when they're going through a traumatic event, in their minds, they may get pulled back into that time and place. And so a 3-2-1 grounding technique is very helpful to keep them in the here and now. One other thing I'll say about this is make sure you know they can stop at any time if it becomes too much. Don't push them, because that's part of the safety. So you can say this how I wrote it, or you can say this in any version that you feel comfortable, as long as you're grounding them and you're letting them know what's about to happen. Okay. Step 2. So if I was working with Sarah, that's the first thing that I would do. The second thing I would do is I would go into the lifeline creation, or the chronological mapping. So on a sheet of paper, I'll draw a horizontal line, and that will be from birth to today. Now, she's not going to remember anything from birth. None of your clients are. Okay. And so what the client is going to do, they're basically going to mark key points, key milestones on that timeline. So maybe they graduated from high school, or maybe they remember something very significant that happened to them in childhood. Whatever those are, they're going to mark it on the timeline. Sarah, she graduated from college at age 22. She moved to a new city at 24. She marks this on her timeline. And then she also marks the time when the assault happened. Okay, it happened at age 26. If they remember the date, fantastic. Write it down. If they don't remember the date and just the age, just write the age, as close as you can get. Okay. This visual immediately is going to put the traumatic event in the context of their life, because what people do who have a traumatic experience, sometimes they isolate that event as that only event that has happened to them. And so putting it in context helps them to understand that, you know what, and we'll see this later on as I explain this, but it helps them to understand that this isn't the only thing that has happened to me. They're not in a bad way, like, other bad things have happened, but other good things have happened to me in my life. And this one thing that happened, I'm actually allowing it to define my whole timeline, my whole life. And I'm not going to let that happen. I'm not going to do that. So that's the place that you want to bring them to, which is why you're doing this. And you're doing it visually because their memory, remember, their memory has been impacted by the trauma. So what you're doing is you're essentially bringing them down like memory lane and helping them remember who they are. I think that was like a line from a movie, from The Lion King. Remember who you are, right? That was Mufasa saying that to Simba when Simba forgot who he was. But in a lot of ways, it's a very similar thing that's happening here. All right, so let's move on to 3. So Sarah has her timeline. She has her milestone. She has her point of trauma on that timeline as well. And so you might say, let's go to age 26 on your timeline. Okay. Notice the image that pops into your mind. Tell me what you remember. What do you see? What do you feel? What do you hear? Step by step. And so in this moment, this is where a lot of your work will really be situated, because you might spend an entire session here. The way it's written out, step by step, as if you can do these things like boom, bang, boom. No, not like that. This step will take some time, because she may not immediately open up or remember. She may not have all the details. Each time you come to session, you may go through step 1, step 2, step 3, and stay in step 3. Stay in step 3 until you get enough data and enough information. But what's going to happen is Sarah is essentially going to go ahead and start talking. So she may say, I'm walking to my car in a parking lot. I hear footsteps, right? Because you asked her, what do you hear? I hear footsteps. I sense someone behind me. I see a dark figure. I feel my heart pounding. The reason why you're asking her to recall in this way, in this sensory way, is because part of memory is sensory as well. We capture bits and pieces of information through our senses. It's similar to like when you smell something and it triggers a memory. It's sometimes good, sometimes bad. Or when you see something and it triggers a memory, maybe nostalgia, right? But that's why you're doing this, because you want to help her reconstruct those memories, reintegrate positive memories as well, because chances are she is leaving out some positive memories and just highlighting the ones that are connected to the trauma. But this is why you're asking for all of this sensory information. And so what you'll do is also, if you see it's becoming too much for her, you're going to ground her in the here and now. And you're just still going to do that generally, just so you don't lose her in the trauma and re-traumatize her. And so you might say, that was October 14th, 2003, right outside your office, right? And so that's sort of a clever way of saying, that's not happening now. That happened in 2023. And then, she'll say, yeah, that happened. In this example, the client says, yes, around 6 p.m., dusk lighting. And so again, she's giving you sensory information. And so each detail, each sensory detail is tied to a date, is tied to a time, is tied to a place. And what you're doing is you're slowly shifting that memory from a flashback into a story situated in that timeline. Because remember, it's fragmented. Even if the person says, I remember it was like yesterday, and they can tell you everything, you still go through this because there's still, I guarantee you, pieces of information and data that's missing. And so this is what you do. You spend time here. Okay, let's move on. Step 4. Okay, step 4. This is when you've had several sessions of this processing. Okay, I can't tell you how many sessions are needed. Everyone is different. But once you gain enough information and enough data, you can move to step 4. This is where the meaning making and reauthoring happens. And you'll do this slowly. You'll incorporate this. You'll ask, what strengths did you draw on that evening? And you might ask that once you start to see that she is, that in my story here, that Sarah is starting to just become a bit more bold, where she's starting to heal a little bit, where maybe she's telling the story more fluidly, or even if she's giving you bits and pieces that sound like strength, okay? You might want to capitalize on that and ask, what strengths did you draw on that evening? And then she might say, I remembered my training in self-defense. I kicked and ran to the well-lit side of the lot, and I kept dialing 911. So when you hear that, the reauthoring, what happens is you're essentially inviting Sarah to reframe herself not as a victim, but as a victor, right? As a survivor who took action in a very scary, duress situation. And so that becomes part of the new narrative, and that becomes part of the new memory as well. Because when you ask her to retell the story the next time, she's going to retell the story with that piece of information. And if she doesn't, make sure you remind her of that. And you also want to give her the language. So, for example, if she doesn't say victim, if she doesn't say something like victor or survivor, then you give her that language. She may say, I remember, I almost became a victim, or I felt like a victim that night. You might say, so what I hear you say is, you were victorious, that you in that moment, you did have control. So you want to capitalize on those moments so that you can start inputting new information into the client's story that reframes them as that. And so the more and more you do that, again, you'll do that over the course of several sessions. If you're developing a treatment plan for them, you can quite literally maybe do this over the course of 12 weeks. It's done in shorter terms, shorter contexts. But you can do this. Next, step 5, and this is the last step here. Okay, the last step is revisiting and reconsolidation. This is similar to what I was just talking about the new narrative. So over several sessions, right? Sarah, she's going to tell her story, each time narrating with more detail, right? More detail. each time integrating the new insights, and each time linking back to her lifeline, solidifying the memory when and where. And what you're going to do as the therapist with that timeline, because you're not going to discard it, you're going to keep that timeline. You're going to tie her areas of strengths to other areas where she was strong or other areas where they were victorious. If there's multiple points of trauma on that timeline, then you do this exact same thing with all those points of trauma. Okay? And you link them all together in a victorious struggle. You're contextualizing this in a victorious way. Okay, in a way that has hope, that has meaning, that has success, not in that traumatic way. And so what will happen over time is her memory will be updated, and you will have effectively reconsolidated her thinking about what happened to her, why it had happened, and you would have reduced that fragmented part of her memory. And that is really how the trauma will be healed, okay? Because now what will happen is when she thinks about the story, she'll have new pieces of information, fuller pieces of information, all in the context of her being a victor or a survivor, or whatever the meaning, the positive meaning was that you were able to help facilitate. Okay, and so that's what this is, reintegrating memories via the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is the part of the brain that will reconsolidate the memory and the sensory experiences as well. It's going to help in all of that. Some other points here before we end, because that is all to that technique. If you have questions about this specifically, please reach out to me. I can help clarify or even go into greater depth in some of these. Maybe even share with you some examples of clients who have benefited from this. I'll say this for my personal experience. I've worked with clients who've had traumatic experiences in this way, and it's taken the course of 10 or 12 sessions. Okay, maybe even them coming back to counseling after some months to go through this again. So it may not be like a one-stop shop and you're healed forever. But I will say when clients do return, they're not in that same place they were before. They are a lot more clear, a lot healthier. It's just that perhaps because they didn't continue to practice their healing and continue to practice some of the tools that I may have given them, they may backslide, if you will. Or sometimes clients who are still in the situations or close to the situations that traumatize them, they end up being re-traumatized by a newer experience. And so you have some of that. But the other things that I wanted to mention before I closed out here, make sure you integrate hope and forgiveness through this process as well. Okay, hope is important because it is future looking, it's future oriented. And in this way, you can cultivate some goal setting. Where do you want to be? You may even open up that way. At the end of this counseling experience of your treatment, where do you want to be? Where do you see yourself next year? And they're going to say things like healed and delivered and set free and terminology like that. Identify, how do you get there? Help them build agency. You can do this. When you talk about how they can get there, that's when you're going to identify tools that are going to help post-treatment, support systems, things like that. The other thing is forgiveness. You want to introduce this idea of forgiveness. You may have to have sessions that are outside of what I just talked about, those steps, and just deal specifically with forgiveness here. Because forgiveness, depending on what the trauma was, they may feel as if they can't forgive, or they may make a decision not to forgive, right? And so introduce forgiveness in a structured way. First, uncover the pain, right? Make them have them name the pain and how it may have impacted them. Then help them move to a decision of forgiveness, and let them know that that's not condoning what has happened, but it's a choice that they choose for themselves. frame the forgiveness as a gift for themselves. And that's really what it is. It's a gift that they're giving to themselves. Okay? And it is an act of grace towards the other person. And so you do want to highlight that. Then you work with them through the emotions. Have them journal. Have them go through prayer, the guided imagery that you create with them. And then deepen that, right? Bring them through exercises of compassion for themselves and for others. So you may have them involve in altruistic activities like feeding the homeless or working with survivors of similar traumas or other traumas, and that will help them move to a place of forgiveness. Okay. Here are some practical insights, some strategies that I often provide my clients with. We have hope journals. So as part of the start of trauma-focused therapy, I have them, if they don't have a journal, I usually just tell them go out, buy a journal. They do. Most clients already have a journal they can use. But anyway, a hope journal, a journal specifically for hope, where they record small wins every time we visit that. So what's in your hope journal today? What small win did you have, right? And that reinforces agency. Forgiveness rituals. I bring clients through this all the time. Write the letters of pain, then maybe have them burn it or there's like different things that you can purchase. There's like balloons that go up in the air, specifically for this type of thing. There's a lot of cool gimmicks to this. But yeah, have them do some sort of forgiveness ritual. And then also, you may want to have different affirmation statements ready for them in session, right? It's curtailed specifically towards them and their situation. And because you're their counselor, you're going to have that intimate insight. Okay. If they're ready to read it, then great. If they're not, then it's okay. Save it for the next session. But those are just some practical integrations that I often use with my clients when I'm working with them in, again, client-focused therapy. But I hope that was helpful. Again, if you have any questions, let me know. We're going to try to get back on track with these live webinars. It's just been very busy here in the summer with the children out from school and in activities and family reunions and family vacations. But I want to thank you for your understanding and patience through it all. Take care and God bless you.